Welcome to our Introduction to CSS. CSS is short for Cascading Style Sheets. And what you can do with Cascading Style Sheets, you can really bring your web page content to life. You can transform a plain website just like this that's just built out in HTML and has no additional CSS attached to it. You can transform it and make it completely different over and over again just by applying different styling to that web page. My name is Lawrence and I've been a web developer for over 14 years and I use CSS on a regular basis. I'm going to be sharing my knowledge with you. CSS, JavaScript, HTML, they're the cornerstone technologies that are used on most websites. And they help create visually engaging web content for users. We're going to be going through how to break down your HTML code, how to section it off, and use CSS to really bring out these different elements within HTML. We're also going to be going over how to create sticky footers, just like this one we see here below. And as well, we're going to be talking about navigation and how to really bring out your navigation buttons. We're going to be going over CSS step by step, showing you how to use it, how to implement it, even going how to nest different selectors in order to really be able to pick out those particular elements that you want to isolate and style. All of the source code and files are going to be included, as well as exercises in order for you to be able to practice CSS as you go through the course. Along with HTML and JavaScript, CSS is the cornerstone technology used by most websites to create visually engaging web pages. We're going to be showing you how to add CSS to your HTML code to really bring it to life. The very definition of CSS is the presentation of your HTML code, how you want to present it to your user. So we've got some HTML code here and we've actually started to add a little bit of CSS. So we're going to be going over that within this lesson. And this is the web page as it looks right now. So as you can see, we've got our navigation here at the top. We've got an introduction, a heading here. We've got a little bit of content. We also have a form, call to action, and then we've got some additional information about what's being presented on this page itself. So when we go to the code, we can bring in CSS in a number of ways into our HTML. And one of those ways is creating inline styles in your HTML. So you can take any one of these different elements that you have in HTML and add additional inline styling. So take, for instance, we've got our H1 tag here, our header tag. So we have the ability to add in style as an attribute to that tag and then attach any one of the CSS properties and values into it. So take, for instance, if we wanted to change the color of our Ultimate HTML course. So all we would have to do is type in color, and then here we can either pick a color or we can use the default color values such as green and blue, red, yellow, and so on. And then there's also the RGB colors that we can use. So for now, the one that we're going to be using is we're just going to use kind of this purplish color here. So I'm just going to pick one here and add that in. So this is the hexadecimal value of the color. And when we save that and refresh it, so remember again, we're applying a color to this font that we've got here in our H1 header. And so when we refresh that, you can see that this actually does change the font color. We can also use CSS by opening and closing style. So if we wanted to apply that same color background to all the H1 tags on that particular page, I can take that out over here and I can just bring that over here at the top, and then this is going to be an on-page style. And when we go back out and we refresh it, there shouldn't be any change in that because this is an on-page style. And thirdly, we also have the ability to attach a style sheet. So the way to do that is to place that in the head section of your HTML code, and we link our CSS sheet, our CSS document, to this particular HTML document. And this is the most effective way to add styling to your web pages if you've got a collection of web pages for an entire website that you want to be applying this styling to. Take, for instance, if I have multiple pages, they all have H1 tags here at the top, and I want to change these H1 tags across my entire website. And if all of my web pages are linked to the same style sheet, all I have to do is go over to where the style sheet is located and add that in. And now we're just going to go back here and we can see that we actually don't have any styling attached here, so I can actually just remove out all the styling. We don't have any inline styling either. And when I go out to the page, we can see that we still have that same color. And going over to the CSS page, so this is actually located in a folder CSS, and the file itself is just called style.css. So if I was actually to change the color of this, I'm going to change it to red and go back out here, refresh, we're going to see that it is red indeed. So throughout this course, we're going to be adding in styling. We're going to be doing some inline styling, we're going to be adding on-page styling, and then additional styling within the style CSS file. So again, depending on how you're using your styling, if you only have one page for your website and all that styling is being held here, you can do this within the on-page styling as well, or if you have some minor changes that you want to add in, you can do a combination of the three. But the best practice always is to keep your styling separate, and this helps you when you do work on a project and maybe you come back 6 months down the line, and so you don't have to actually search through and find the styling within the page. You just go to that one style sheet, and that gives you the ability to update the entire website. So that's the main advantage of doing it this way and linking to a style sheet. And this is the preferred way to do this. So also, you're probably wondering, well, what happens if I do something like this, where I've got style, so I've got my connected style.css. I'm also going to do it on page here, H1, and I'm just going to do different colors so we can actually differentiate between them. So I'm going to do this one is going to be blue, and then this one over here, we're just going to do style equals, and I'm going to do another color there. So maybe this color can be, just going to do it this way, green. So we're able to differentiate between them. So over here we've got a reddish color, over here we've got a bluish color, and over here we've got green. So what do you think, which color do you think the H1 text is going to be when I refresh this page? And if you said green, you are correct, because the way that this is being read is it's being read in order. If I was to remove out this green, which color do you think it's going to be now? Do you think it's going to be blue, or do you think it's going to be red? So going out here and refreshing it, we see that it's blue. So going back to our source code, And I've got a little bit of a trick here. So what happens if I move the style sheet below this style? So over here, we're indicating that we want all of our H1s to have this color. And then over here, we're indicating that we want it to be red. So when I go back out to the page and I refresh the page, it's going to be red. Because again, the order of the presentation of that particular value is going to be important in the way that the browser is rendering out that color. So it's coming into the HTML page, it's reading out this HTML code, it's hitting the style here, so it's initially placing this H1 here with this color, but then it's hitting this style sheet and it's going over and it's reading the H1 to be this color. And that's actually why I removed it over here, because this would be the last place that the browser is hitting what color they're supposed to be indicating for this particular set of content. So remember that order is important, and the order that you're presenting the styling is important as well. And speaking of the word important, there actually is part of the value that you can set as important. So we can set this color and we can indicate that it is important, and saving that. So now we've still got that same order where this initial color, so the red color is coming after the blue color. So we're hitting blue first. Maybe we'll just make it like this so it's a little bit more readable for us. So we'll do red and we'll do blue. So when it hits this blue color, and now it's going to hit the style sheet with red color, but we've added in this word that says important. And so what do you think is going to happen now? What color do you think it's going to be? And if you said it's blue, then you are correct, because this word adding in important actually takes precedence over the following style color changes. So that's a way that you can actually change the order. So if you are presenting it in a particular order and you want to make sure that every H1 tag is blue no matter where it's called for, sometimes you might have styles that are overriding colors and you're actually not sure where the color is coming from, but you want to be 100% sure that your color is going to be forced to be blue, then you add in important. So again, all three ways are going to work the same way. We've got the same values that we can apply, whether we're doing an inline style, whether we're doing an on-page style or an off-page style. And so if they all are all the same, there's also a few other attributes that you can change. So we're going to be getting into these in later lessons, but we just wanted to quickly go over size. So in order to set the size of H1, you can actually change the size of H1. So if I wanted to take, because as you might know from HTML, that H1 is going to be a big text, bolded text, and we do have the ability with CSS to actually overwrite that initial HTML default of having really big text for H1, and we can actually make our H1s smaller than the H2s that we have down here. So this is an example of we've changed all of our H1s here and we've brought them down to be smaller than our H2s. So again, it's that order of setting up the values that once by default within the HTML there's going to be default values and default sizes, and when we do set them within CSS, they are actually going to override what the default HTML settings would have been for that particular element in HTML. And we're going to be getting into this in the later lessons as well in more detail. When it comes to CSS, there's going to be three different ways that you're actually going to be able to select that HTML code. So the first one that we were looking at within the last lesson, we were just be able to select via the tag, via the element name. So we had these H1s. We could have just as easily taken this and set that into paragraphs. So going back out here and refreshing it, we see that this actually changes our paragraph sizes and turns them blue. And I get rid of that sizing there as well. So we've got the ability to select any one of these names here and access the content that's here between. So any one of these elements that have content between with opening and closing tags. So we're not necessarily able to access tags. We are able to access only the tags that have opening and closing, but as well we're able to access images. So if we wanted to have our images, and of course the images aren't going to have any actual text in between, but they do have a size. So if we want to access our images, we can do a width of 50 pix, a height of 50 pix, and go back out here and refresh it. And we can see that the CSS will actually again override what the default setting was for the image. So all that HTML was originally doing, all that the browser was doing with the HTML code, is it was rendering out this image at its default size, which is 400 by 200. But with CSS, we were able to override that setting and select that image. So again, these are the CSS is going to control particular parts of the HTML code, so only the relevant parts. So even if we put a color here, we are able to put a color here, but it's not really applicable to anything within an image. So we don't have anything within that image that can be applicable to that color. So again, you have to be mindful of that when you are adding CSS onto your HTML elements, that they do have those appropriate attributes that you can change within CSS and within styling. So a second way to actually select, so if we want to be a little bit more particular, and right now we're selecting paragraphs, but maybe we don't want to select all three of these paragraphs, we want to only have it applicable to maybe the second paragraph here. So one way to do that is to give this particular paragraph an ID. And when you give an ID value to an element in HTML, you can only apply that ID once on a particular page. So you can't have multiple IDs of use this one. So we're just going to put it as use this one. So you wouldn't be able to reuse this named value into other paragraphs, and it wouldn't make a lot of sense to have more than one with just that ID. And as well, when you're using JavaScript, when you're using IDs, this is the way to be able to select a particular element, a particular piece of HTML content, and select it in JavaScript, and then as well you're able to select it the same way within CSS. And now within the styling, we have to be able to select that particular ID. And all we have to do is do a hashtag, and then here we've got a listing of all the different IDs that we have on this particular HTML page, and I'm just going to select the use this one, and I'm going to just give it a background. And I'm going to select a particular color for the background, and also adding in a background color to it, and also a foreground color. So I'm going to change that text color to be white. And when I go and refresh it, we see that this does have this highlighted effect. So I accidentally clicked one of those links up there, but we can see that it is applying this CSS, the styling, only to this particular element that has that ID. So oftentimes, I'm using Chrome right now, and oftentimes it's a good idea when you are developing, if you want to select these particular elements, you can select them out and open that up within the console to be able to better view the HTML code as you're hovering over it. So if I want to select another one, I could do that as well. And you see here that once I do click it, it actually brings me to here, and I can see that, okay, well, this one doesn't have an ID, and if I want to change this color, I might have to try add a class to it or an ID, or I might have to add some other styling mechanism if I want to do some particular styling to that. So that's how you add an ID to an element in HTML, and then adding those IDs, again, you can connect it in your CSS and then as well within JavaScript. In the last lesson, we talked about adding IDs, and IDs are very useful if you want to select any one particular element or selection of that element and the content that's contained within it. So that's where IDs would be used, but IDs aren't really practical if I wanted to attach a particular style to different sections of my HTML document. And as we can see here, we've got something called a class. And classes, the good thing about classes is they can be reused over and over again within your HTML document as a way to attach different styling classes to those elements. And so it doesn't necessarily need to go to every single div that I have to attach this class to. I can also attach this class to this particular paragraph. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set a value here for class. And the way you represent classes in your styling is you do this dot and then the class name. So that's different than when you're using ID, where you do that number sign there, or hash sign, or pound sign. So using an ID, you would use it this way, and using a tag would just be like this. So if we had actually an HTML element that we had like that, then that's the way that we would attach to that particular element. But most of the time you're picking out these already predefined elements in HTML. And then over here we're just going to say using a class, so that we do have all three of these different ones defined here. And again, so all you have to do when you're using a class, you just do this period and then the class name. So this is going to attach this background color, which I'm going to make yellow so that it really does stand out, and remove that color. Oops. And then go back out to the document and see which ones turn yellow. And as we can see here, when we go to this element, so this element was the paragraph, and any text and content contained within this paragraph is yellow. And then these were divs down here. And the importance of using divs and spans, again, divs and spans are going to become very useful, especially when you're doing styling, because divs are a great way to break up your content and able to section it off. So here we've got our div of container. Sometimes you'll see a div of a heading or a navigation div, and so on, and also footer divs. So these are just different ways to divide up your different sections within your HTML code. And then also using the divs, you can attach different styling to each particular section. And then if you had a whole bunch of sections that you wanted similar, you could use classes for each one of those sections. So here I've got divs that are lessons, and they're just some lesson content. So I'm using class here to differentiate that. Okay, I want all of the content between this div here to take the properties of lesson. And then over here, this was just a sample. So if I wanted this particular section of my HTML code to also take the same class, I can do this as well. And the difference between the divs and spans is that divs start out on a new line. It starts out in a new block of code. So the divs will reserve out the entire width of the page, whereas spans, you actually can't see them because they keep the code in line. And then this is just another way that if you wanted to use classes within these spans and you want to isolate particular pieces of the code, so I've removed the class off of there and I've only kept it on HTML coding how to, and when I refresh it, we see that this is the way the span is going to work. It's not reserving that entire page or that entire section. I'm just going to shrink it even more so it's just focused on that text HTML, and you can see that you can't really tell that the span is there because it's keeping everything in line, as opposed to the divs that are starting out on a new line and taking up that whole block all the way to the end. So the same thing here with the paragraphs and the line breaks, where the paragraph takes that whole section of code and it keeps that buffer above and below it, whereas the line breaks, they just break to the next line of code, and they're not necessarily taking up that entire space, and they don't have that break where it's on top and below. So that's how you would be using spans and divs and attaching classes to them to really break up your code and style it appropriately for presentation to the user. In the last lesson, we talked about setting a background color for these particular classes. So we had class lesson, and we were able to set the background color to them simply by applying it to that particular class. So what happens if we want to change the background color of that entire page that we have, the whole body area? So what we can do is we can use body as our selected element and then apply background to that entire body. So again, we have many different ways to apply that. We can do an inline here, we can do an on page, and then as well we can do the off page. So the purposes of this lesson, we're just going to do style right on the page itself, and we're going to apply that particular style to the body by selecting within style. We're just going to do body. So you actually see that this is fairly common to just call over to the body if you want a particular background color changed for the entire body of your HTML document. So I'm just going to go over and apply that. I'm going to be removing this class here and going over and doing a background. And down here we're just using background and we put a color. But with background, actually there's a few options here for applying color. And the difference here is that this is there's a condensed way to attach background information. So when you do background yellow, it's smart enough now, the browsers are smart enough now to be able to interpret that background yellow means background dash color yellow. So I'm going to set this background color to, maybe we can do a dark gray, and now we're just going to have to change our font color. So we're just going to do color, and I'm just going to put it to white. So going back out to our page, refreshing it, we see that we've got entirely new look to our content, and we've got this. Now our content is this grayish color, the whole background is gray, and all of our text has changed to be white. And this again is the quickest way to do this. I'm just going to change this one over to black. And that now that we can see that we've changed the entire look and feel of our website just by changing that body area. And that's how you do fairly big updates to the content, because the body encompasses everything that you have. All of your visible HTML code is going to be contained within body, and if you want to force a particular background color and a particular font color, you can do it in this way. So also going back to background, so we do have the ability to do background image, and then we can browse over to the image that we want to use. And then this is the way that I would add a background image. And when I refresh it here, actually going back out here, I had to do a little bit of an update there to the path, because actually my path, I'm using localhost, so I'm actually not able to go back into other directories that are below the main root. So that's why I had to change that. I've got another file here called tile.png, and this is a now attached tile over to the background. And when you are using a PNG, so this is a see-through PNG, and if I do apply this background, sorry, it's not actually a see-through PNG. I thought it was, because I was actually using the same color there. But so changing the color to red, if it was a see-through PNG, we'd be able to see the red through the background there, and you can quickly see that the red shows up, but it's overtaken by the image, and that's why we're not able to see that red background. So with background images, we've got a few other options as well that are typically used, and one of them is that you're typically going to be using is this repeat. So we can set it to no repeat, and this we can see that this image is actually repeating. So when we set it to no repeat, we do see our background red color, and we see that this image is only one instance of it. It's not repeating as it was. And with repeat, we've actually got a few other options here. We can set repeat X and repeat Y. So repeat X will repeat it across the X-axis, and repeat Y will repeat it across the Y-axis. So there's a few different options of what can be done here with your background. And also, I'm just going to do another level here. So background, and we've got this option here to do background position. So I'm going to position it on the right hand side, and that should move all of that over to the right hand side. Instead of being by default on the left, it's on the right hand side, and we can see because we are repeating, so maybe I'm just going to remove out repeat X and do bottom. So the background position will be bottom. So we see that it's pulled right down to the bottom there, and this is where that image now is repeating along the X-axis, but it's pulling the whole image right down to the bottom. So there's a lot of different ways how you can control where your image gets positioned. And then when we look at this is a condensed version where we can do the same thing within one line of code. So we can do background, and now we've got all of these options here as well. The same thing that we were able to do before. We also have this scroll and fixed, and what fixed is, just show you what that is. Going back out, and a fixed image is going to hold that within one place. So now when we scroll up and down, we see that it holds it within that fixed position. I had to do an update here because we weren't using the shorthand yet for all of this. And then there's also the background scroll. So again, background position, and we do have that. I think I have to actually remove this one because we can't have fixed and scroll within the same one. When we go back out to there, actually it was background attachment. That background attachment is fixed, and now we can see that the fixed holds it in place, and background, we've got background scroll, so that allows us to move it up and down along with the page. So that's the default. So again, going back to that condensed way of writing, that now we're able to combine all four of these different, or all five of these different types of background values, and we're able to do this shorthand where we're actually combining all all of these. So I'm just going to do red, and then I'm going to do the URL, so I have the same one there, and then I'm also going to patch, I'm actually going to do a no repeat, and I'm going to do bottom, and you can see here that Dreamweaver actually is giving me these options. I'm going to do fixed, and I quickly, just to comment out all of this stuff here above, we can do this kind of slash and then the asterisk, and then when we want to end the commenting area, we do the asterisk and the slash. And then this is a great way to add in comments or to block out certain parts of your CSS code that you don't want to use any longer. So now I've just done it in shorthand, and actually I'm used to doing it in shorthand, so that's why I was having a little bit of trouble remembering that attachment. But this is definitely a more efficient way of doing it, to add background within the shorthand method. And when we refresh it, we see that we do still have all of those same properties. It's fixed, we've got red, it's at the bottom, and all of those properties are being placed within that particular background value, just within one line of code within the shorthand. That's how you work with backgrounds, and there's quite a lot of options with backgrounds as well, but these are going to be the main ones that you're going to be using and attaching these if you're attaching images and colors. So I've added a bunch of additional lessons that I've added on our HTML page, and when you are designing, you want to have some consistency for the sections. You want something that the user can kind of expect to see, and when we look at this, it doesn't really look very consistent. So I've got this one as a black one, and then this one, just the heading is black here, so it's not really the consistency that I'm looking at when I'm using classes, because the classes are I've got this same class that's applied lesson over here, and I might not necessarily want to remove that because maybe there was a reason that I had set the class up there. So there's a few different ways to kind of be able to isolate out different sections and areas. So what I'm looking at here is I want to be able to isolate out my divs, and I've got a class there, and I want to really isolate out maybe all of these H2 tags and highlight them so that they can really look like they're separate predefined areas, and maybe just get rid of all of that. So I'm going to simply just remove out this lesson here and go back over to the document, refresh it, and see what this looks like. So now we see that our H2 tags, they're no longer, it's no longer easy to see that they are being differentiated. It all looks like kind of the same thing, and I actually did like it that they were getting highlighted. So the objective of this lesson is to highlight all of those H2s. And since we are only looking at all of the H2s, and we're only using H2s as those lesson titles, this is going to be an easy one for us to select. So we're going to select just H2 tags, and we're going to put a background there. So again, you can do it the two different ways. You can do it the shorthand, or you could do it the standard. So I'm just going to do it standard, and I'm just going to add in a background color. And go back out just to see what that's going to look like. And you can see that now it does stand out a little bit more, and maybe I'm going to add in some padding around it. And we're going to get into padding later on as well within this course. So you can see that what padding is essentially doing, it's moving that over, and I still don't really like the way that looks, so I'm going to have to go with a darker gray. Because remember, we're always looking at contrast as well as a way of really highlighting what we're doing, and we want this these to really contrast we want the text to stand out from the background. So always take into consideration the contrast that you have between the front color and the back color, and always make sure that the text is actually readable and content-wise. So that's why I'm not really a big fan of having images in the background, because sometimes images, especially if you have like really colorful images or different variations of image shading, it can really throw off what text you've got over on top. So always make sure that you're wary of the difference between contrast. And so this is all we had to do in order to select our H2s. We took the ones that we're using anyway within the structure of the HTML code, and H2s, the simplest way was just simply to just grab the H2s. And this way we don't have to go down and add class to every single one. So in case we might not have added it to, we might have added it for some reason to this one, but not to the other ones. We're not selecting by class, and if we did want to select out all these, we don't want to go through the trouble of adding class to every single one. We want to just be able to differentiate and select that particular element that we're looking to work with. So now we wanted to do some additional updates to our navigation menu, because typically, even though your navigation links, they're actually going to be hyperlinks, you don't want that typical underlined look to them. You want to have something different to differentiate them as not just hyperlinks, that they're actually page links and navigation links. So we're just going to go back into our HTML document, and maybe I'm just going to remove this out because we're not really using that, and going back over to here, and I'm going to remove out Google because we really don't need to be clicking out to Google. So we're going to have page 1, page 2, page 3. This is going to be our typical navigation menu. And in order to select the navigation menu, I can just do nav and select out all of that content that I have there. I'm going to set a background, because I want this navigation bar to really stand out. So I'm going to set a background color. And again, when in doubt, it's always a good idea to use grayscale colors when you're designing. And then this helps you to kind of really be able to visualize what particular elements are standing out and how the content's standing out. So I'm going to switch the color to black and see what that looks like when I refresh it. And we see that we get that entire length, and we still have these underlined hyperlinks. So in order to remove the underlining of hyperlinks, what I can do is I can do A, and then, so this is going for all of my hyperlinks, all of my A tags, the anchor tags, and I can do text, declaration, and just going to select none. And that's going to remove out those hyperlinks. And we can see here that now that they've really been taken out, and they're starting to look a little bit more like a navigation menu. And this again is where we're going to have to use that padding to really be able to pick out padding, or pick out our navigation menu. So we're just going to do some padding around it, maybe do a 10 pixel padding, and go back out there and see what that looks like. And also, I'm going to add in this text transform, so I'm going to transform all of these to uppercase. And I also need to do a little bit more there to really be able to differentiate them. So another thing that I can do is I can do a margin. And I'm just going to maybe do a margin of 10 pixels as well. And then also another thing that I can do, background color. So going back to that background color, because again, I really want all of these to stand out. So maybe I can even just do them white for now, because I want to have a really good contrast so that navigation is really easy to spot. So now we can see how that's coming along, and we can see that we've got our main nav bar in the back, so indicated by that line, and then we've got these menu items. So one other thing, maybe we need to change the height of it to be 50 pixels. So we better cover off all of that spacing. That padding is really throwing us off there, so I'm just going to remove that and maybe put the padding along there so that we have a little bit better spacing, and maybe even remove out that height. So that's a little bit more dynamic there. So we've got that padding around there, and we're actually able to reserve out the spacing, and I'm going to add in a little bit of padding here as well. So I'm going to do a 5 pixel padding, and going back out one more time, refresh. So this is starting to look a little bit better, more like a navigation bar where we've got these different clickable navigation boxes, and when we click on these will actually bring us over to the new pages. So in the previous lesson, when we were setting padding for these different elements, padding and margin are together. They're part of the box model of CSS, and you can actually see that within Chrome when we go over here and we do an inspect element. I just had to open that up a little bit more, but when we go over to our inspect element, we can see that we've got this kind of box here. So we've got our content in the middle in blue, we've got padding on the outside, we've got a border, and we've got a margin. So all of this is what's known as the box model. And the way that that works is it's just a boxed way of thinking about when you are creating your padding, when you're creating your border and your margin, and determining what to use when. So when we look at our padding is the first one that immediately surrounds the content, and this is actually going to push the content and the spacing of that boxed area around that content to be 10. So even if we had a border set up, which we can actually do right now as well, so I'm going to just set up a border there around each. And again, this is shorthand. So with borders, you've got the typical border width. You also have border color, and I believe it's border style. So these are the 3 typical ones that you would be using for borders, but usually right now most of the time I'm just using that shorthand method where I just do border, and I include everything in there. So we include the color there. So I'm going to do a really bright color, so it just stands out there. And here we're just going to pick solid. So we have a solid border for the style. And then for the border width, we're just going to do 1 pix. So now when I refresh it, we can see that now we've got these borders. So again, going back to the box model, we've got our content in the middle. So this page 1, page 2, page 3, these are all pieces of content that are in the middle. Then we've got our padding immediately after there. We've got our border immediately after there. And then after that, we've got our margin. So the margin is what sits on the outside. And going back, we see that our margin is 10 there. And that means that I haven't selected the right one there. So when I go inspect element, I see that the margin is 10. I've got a border, I've got my padding, and then the auto sizing of the content in the middle. And actually this, just as we were just looking at this, it can actually get fairly complex when you've got several different elements and sections of code and you've got margins, padding, and borders there. So sometimes they could move up and down, as we had in our previous lesson where these ones were floating above that initial box. So yeah, you have to always be mindful of how you're using these. And again, these are shorthand methods. So much like what we were looking at with backgrounds and much of what we just looked at with borders, with padding, we've got the option to do padding dash top and isolate out all of these different padding areas. So we've got padding right, padding bottom, and padding left. So you can actually isolate these all out and have them to have separate values. So I can do 9, 8, 7, 6, and going back out to here, selecting them, we can see that we do have this 9, 8, 7, 6 values. And when you are using the shorthand, so I'm just going to write this out in shorthand. And the reason that I did it within this order is because this is the order that the shorthand reads it in. So if I'm just going to bracket that out and do padding, you can see that I do 9 picks, 8 picks, 7 picks, and 6 picks. So working clockwise from the top, I'm going to refresh this and reselect this particular element. We see that nothing has actually changed because the shorthand is the same thing. It's the same thing as going top and bottom and left and right, and again working clockwise. So you can do the same thing with margins as well. And there's also some more you can do with the shorthand here. So if you wanted to do top and bottom and left and right 8, so you want them all the same there, this is another way to do the shorthand. So we can do the top, bottom at 9 and the left and right at 8. And then going on, if you were to do actually 7, it would take top, bottom, and it would take right and left. So until there's 4 values, it's not going to actually use this one. It's going to use this one as the 4th value if it's not filled out. So that's how you do the shorthand. And the same thing with margins. Typically you could do your margin top, and then you could do margin right, and it's going to work in the same clockwise fashion. We could do margin bottom, and then margin left. So again, clockwise, and we're just going down, but you could set these values to whatever you want to set. And just gonna refresh this back one more time, just so that we can see the way that the margins are working. So margin 10, 9, 8, 7, and that's working around the page there in that fashion. And so if we even set these margins larger, actually it's going to be a little bit more prevalent there. So if we set the margins to those, we can see that those margins are actually taking place, but because we're encasing them in that navigation area, even though the margins are there, it's only taking these, it's redefining these margin values as what's available here. So again, when you're working with inside different sections that already have those margins, so if I was to take these out and apply them to something entirely separate, maybe I can just do it to this contact form. So maybe this way it's going to be a little bit more visible. So when we look at our contact form, we get our margins there that we are able to see. So selecting that out, we see that we do have this margins all the way around. And the margining is from that initial text that's atop there. And now, even if we set 550, This is going to be a whole lot more visible, and now it's taking up 550 pixels of space at the top, and then left, right, bottom, and left. So again, margins on the outside, and we're just going to remove those for now. And going back, and I believe we had a margin of 10. So this was, again, that shorthand way of writing margins. So we're just going to do 10 pixels all the way around, refresh it, and have this applied to our navigation area. So again, because this is in another contained section and we don't have that much more space to work with, it's not able to actually reserve out that additional margining. So maybe this isn't the best example of where to use margins, but again, you have to think of it within this box model that we do have our margin on the outside, border, padding, and then content. And doesn't matter how you're going to write that within your HTML code. If you're using the shorthand, it's always going to be interpreted by the browser in this type of format. In the last lesson, we were building out our navigation, and we had attached a particular set of styling to any hyperlink. But the real problem with this is that what if we have another hyperlink here? So we have something going somewhere entirely different, and it's actually not going to fit in with our navigation. Maybe there's a link here to find out more about this particular piece of text, and we go back out and we refresh it and we say, uh-oh, now that's not what we need. We don't want to have the same as our navigation here at the top. We don't want to have this navigation button down here. So what we have to do is we have to actually nest this particular set of styling information into the navigation bar. And the way that we can do this is we do this kind of two-piece selection where we do navigation bar, but the A is only going to apply to anything that's contained within this parent. So now when we go back out here, we see that this has gone back to default HTML because it no longer fits and matches our selection here that we've specified within our styling code. So all we have here, we've got nav, it has to be the top level parent, and any anchor text or hyperlinks that are contained within there is going to take these values and these properties. And again, you have to be careful when you are doing nesting, because if we have something like this and we're attaching additional just general styling to any hyperlinks, and I'm just going to make it, we'll make it pink so that it's really visible. So now all of our hyperlinks anywhere on the page are going to be pink with a pink background, and we see that this is actually taking even our image hyperlink over here, our hyperlink. Interesting thing is it didn't get to the navigation yet, but if we do something like this, and we specify that all the hyperlinks need to be pink, it's important, it's actually going to override this specific selector. But because when we're only doing the hyperlinks and we've got a more specific selector here, this actually overrides it, even though this hyperlink is placed afterwards. And that's another thing to remember when you're thinking about the order that you're presenting your hyperlinks and your CSS styling, is that if you've got a nested value, then it's going to actually take precedence over this value. But when we add important, again, important is going to override and trump all of these other ones that might be set somewhere else. And just like it was important was overriding even when we had an inline style attribute, we can see here that now once again all of our hyperlinks are turning pink. So this is the reason why we use nesting, And also, we're always going to be really mindful of how we're actually doing that selection of any particular element and tag within CSS, because we want to make sure that we're not overriding it at any point. So even though this is okay, this might not be the best way to present backgrounds. You might want to be a little bit more specific down here as well, so that if you did have a container or something else, so we do have ID container, so maybe a better way to present this one would be we do that container first, and then we represent those A tags. And now when I refresh it, we're back to where we were before with those hyperlinks. And now even if I do important, it should only be important for the ones that meet that nested criteria and sort them out. So it's not overriding my navigation menu, and that's something to always keep in mind, that what's going to overwrite something else within styling, and keeping things separated and nesting particular selections is going to be a great way to really isolate out and apply this styling to those particular and intended elements within your HTML code. Advent of CSS 3, we got the ability to have more than just what we had talked about in the previous lesson, where we have these nested selectors. We've got the ability actually to do different combinations. So this is essentially the same thing nested, and it's the same thing as doing a descendant selector. So the H2 is a descendant of lesson, and we're just going to apply background color, this pink background color, to all of them. Going back out to our HTML, we see that we have this pink color that gets applied to every single H2 that is contained within a class, an element with the class of lesson. So going down to the code, we see that we've got this div class lesson. Here we've got one H2, here we've got another H2, and again class lesson H2 and lesson H2. And this is why this pink is being applied to all of them. I can actually pull that out there, and so we won't be able to see that, and go back out here and refresh it, and we see that we still get the value being applied to those H2s that we had set previously. So we've got that background color, we've got the padding, and the padding actually propagates through. So even though we're resetting some additional values, properties and values to the H2, we're still holding on to this padding of 5 pixels, and if we're not actually resetting it, then we're just still holding on to those values. So that's what we talk about when we talk about descendant. We also have a child selector. So a child selector, although oftentimes it looks very similar to what we do with the descendant or the nested value when we're doing a selector. So now we've got the lesson class, and if it's got an H2, so if it's got a child that's an H2, it's going to get this value applied to it. And this only is in effect for children that are immediately under this one. So when we go back out here, and we're going to take a look at lesson number 1 here, and we refresh it, we see that we actually are losing the value on the first H2 tag that we had within that particular lesson. And when we look at the code here, so this is the code here, that we've got this div, it's got a class of lesson, and we've got one H2 and another H2. And the difference is that this H2 is actually nested in another div. So we're not able to select it as an immediate child of lesson anymore, because now it's actually nested within another div, and this div doesn't have a class of lesson. So if we actually switch this around and gave this div a class of lesson, we would only get it for the first one, and we wouldn't get it for any additional divs that had an H2. So again, it's another one of those things where you have to be really careful when you are picking out that you're able to select your proper elements that you do want to apply that style to, and then this always comes back down to your HTML structure to make sure that you've structured it well enough in order to accommodate and use these particular CSS selectors. And sometimes you might be using it this way, and sometimes you might have to come up with another solution and another way to really isolate out that HTML code that you want to apply styling to. We also have what's called an adjacent sibling selector. So what this is going to do is this is going to select all elements that are adjacent siblings of the descendant element. So see what happens here when I apply it to lesson and I refresh it, and we can see that we're only getting it applied to that one particular H2. And so this H2, again, this is falling into where we've got a div here, and right next to this particular div, the sibling to this div is going to be this H2. And that's why this is the only one that's actually getting that property attached to it, because it is the adjacent sibling to this particular selector. And again, regardless of if they're divs, if they're H2s, it's irrelevant, because we're actually only picking up this particular item that's being selected. So again, you have to be really mindful when you're thinking about selecting out different values. We also have a general sibling selector. So this one was only for particular adjacent ones. So this is going to be a general sibling selector, and we'll refresh it and see what happens. So we actually immediately don't see any difference. And maybe we got to add in some more H2s. So I'll add in a bunch of other ones, another H2, and I'm just going to do, maybe I can do it this way, 1, 2, 3, and then this is 0. And we see that it actually gets applied to all of them. But when we go back here, we change this back to the adjacent one, and we go out and we refresh it. We see that it's only applied to that first one, because again, it's not applying to all the general ones, it's only applying to that adjacent one. So it takes a little bit of practice to go over this, but it really does help you pick out and better select out that particular element that you're looking to find and apply styling to. Lesson, we're going to talk about setting up a sticky footer. So what I've done is I originally had the contact form up here. So I want to place my contact form right at the bottom of the page. I want it always to be visible. I like this going across the entire page. So I want to set this up, and I'm going to use CSS in order to do that. And this is what's called a sticky footer going into the code. So all I've done is I've taken contact form. So it has an ID of contact form from before, and all I've done is I've just moved it to the bottom of the page, but it's not really visible, and it is a call to action. It's something that I do want that users to be able to see all the time, because I want everybody to be able to sign up for my website, provide their name and email address to me. And this is why we're including in the sticky footer, and I want this always hovering and floating above. And the way that we're going to do this is using position. So first of all, I'm going to set a background color up for it, and I'm going to pick a really bright color, so something that is going to be very visible. And next, I'm going to set up position. So when I do position, you'll see that there's several options here. I've got absolute, I've got fixed, inherent, relative, static. So I'm going to select fixed for this one. and I'm going to refresh it, and we'll see what happens. And we see that it's actually disappeared off of our HTML document. We don't know where it is. It's fixed, but the location hasn't been specified. And this is when you used fixed, you actually have to use an additional value that to position it. So we can do something top. We can do 50 pixels from the top. Refresh that, and you see that right now it's going to stay within that 50 pixels from the top. We can also maybe do left 50 pixels, so just to keep it spaced properly, but still it's kind of hovering over our content, and maybe going at the top isn't the best way to go, because we really have no way of knowing how much of their browser they're going to be showing. We also have an option to change fixed. We can go position absolute. So just show you how that works. So this was fixed, so it always stayed within the same spot. When I refresh it, nothing looks different initially until I start to scroll down, and we see that it stays in this absolute position. So 50 pixels from left, 50 pixels from top, and it's always going to stay there. And absolute means it's taking it from the absolute page size. So it's calculating everything that you have. It's not taking it from what your screen size is, where the fixed is. It's taking it from the content of the page, and it's keeping it within that position. So that's not what we wanted here. We wanted actually to use that fixed in order to really position it. So top wasn't really working out, so I'm going to change that to bottom. And the same thing from left and right. We can do left, right, and really get to position that. So right now we're positioning it at the bottom left, and it really still doesn't really look good, because we're scrolling and we see that we've got this kind of box in the middle. There's some content that possibly under here, and we can't really read it. So if you are going to do a sticky footer, I advise you do a width. So I'm going to do a width of 100%. So that's going to keep it a fluid width, and refresh that. So now it's starting to look a little bit better. And one other thing, I'm going to just change this to 0, and I'm going to change the color of the text to be black. And now go back out, refresh it, and we can see that right now this looks a lot better, because it just looks like I'm not left wondering what's over here. I can see that this is staying at the bottom, and we're just assuming and treating it as if our page ended here, our screen ended here, and you've got this ability to have this constant call to action that's always visible. And this is very useful when you are creating your websites. So always take advantage of these types of CSS styling values that you can place, and they can be really effective ways to organize your content. So you're probably wondering, okay, well, we know we moved it all the way to the bottom, but what if I had it somewhere at the top, where I actually had it before? Just moving this over, and I can see that now it's back within the container. So question is, now I've moved it over, but I'm still using this fixed position, and I'm actually positioning it. So where do you think this content is going to show up? And if you said it's going to stay where it is because it's fixed, you are correct, because it doesn't matter where you place this now within the page, it's going to always be outputting it according to what the styling values that have been added in, and these are the styling values that it's going to go by. So again, when you are working with CSS, it's important to plan out how you're going to structure your HTML page, and really this doesn't logically make sense. If you want to keep it at the bottom, you should place it at the bottom, even though it doesn't need to be at the bottom. Just from a usability point of view, it's always good to keep the structure of the HTML working in conjunction with the CSS, and so that if you are checking back your code, if you've set up this website and then you've gone off and set up 10 other websites and you go back to this one and you initially open this up, the logical place to look for this code would be near the bottom. So you might not even be looking at the CSS at first. It might be in a separate file, and you might be looking at that HTML, and if you have to make a quick update to it, it just logically makes sense to place it at the bottom. So just from a design point of view, always keep that in mind, that you or other webmasters may need to look at the code, and this is another reason to use commenting. So feel free to comment away and use comments as needed within your CSS, comments within your HTML, and comments within your JavaScript as well, in order to keep your code more readable and your structure easier to understand, and just something that just makes sense, logical sense.